the twilight of the Second Age, when the ancient world still brimmed with myth and wonder, Gil-Galad, High King of the Elves in Middle-earth, found his heart burdened by a weighty foreboding. For in those days, the realm of Númenor stood at the zenith of its power, and the hearts of many of its people had been consumed by longing and pride. Whispers of the king's design to sail into the west against the ban of the Valar reached Gil-Galad's ears. He was no stranger to the shifting fortunes of men. He had watched as the Dunedain, who had once been allies of the Eldar, rose to a mighty kingdom beyond the sundering seas, only to let arrogance and fear twist their hearts. For indeed, Ar-Pharazôn the Golden was on the throne, one of the strongest and proudest men ever to arise from among the Atani, and it was rumored that he had designs upon the blessed realm itself. Yet in this tale we explore a course of events that never came to pass in the true telling. A history in which Gil-Galad, by wisdom or by circumstance, placed himself in the path of the king's folly and altered the fate of men and elves alike. Gil-Galad stood upon the western shores of Lindon, gazing across the sea that glittered beneath the pale moonlight. Outwardly he appeared calm and regal, clad in shimmering mail and a mantle the color of a starless night. But deep in his eyes was a shadow of worry. He had received tidings from Círdan the shipwright that the Númenorians, chafing under the doom laid upon them by the Valar, had grown restless. They were said to be building the greatest armada the world had ever seen, and all for an audacious mission: to sail west, break the ban, and wrest immortality from the powers themselves. The seeds of such pride had been planted long before by the Dark Council of Sauron, who now, so rumor said, was held captive in Númenor, though few believed he was truly a prisoner. Gil-Galad clenched his fists, anger and sorrow mingling in his heart. The pride of Ar-Pharazôn threatened not only Númenor but all the free peoples of Middle-earth, should the Valar's wrath be awakened. In the hush of that hour, as Gil-Galad brooded by the waves, a host of elves gathered around him. Many among them had known the Númenorians as trusted friends. They remembered the days when Tar-Ministir's fleet had come to Middle-earth to aid in the wars against Sauron, driving the dark armies back. They recalled tales of Elendil's ancestors, men noble and wise, who cherished the friendship of the Eldar. Yet they knew, too, that times had changed. The hearts of Númenor now bore a heavier darkness, for their fear of death was stoked into open rebellion against the design of Eru Iluvatar. And so it was that Gil-Galad summoned his counselors and captains, determining that words of reason, if any might still be heeded, must be sent swiftly to the king of Númenor. But he resolved to do more than simply send envoys across the sea. For the notion took him that if Ar-Pharazôn would not relent, then Gil-Galad himself would bar the westward road. Many of Gil-Galad's lords were alarmed at this, for they had never before heard of an elven king seeking to constrain the might of Númenor by force. But Gil-Galad replied that no power in Middle-earth, whether that of men or elf, could set sail for the blessed realm without imperiling all lands under the sun. Should the might of Númenor go forth in defiance of the ban, he said, the Valar shall be compelled to act, and that doom shall not be easily borne even by the wise. For the wrath of the powers may break the very world, and sunder the west from our shores. This would mean the downfall of Númenor, or worse, the ruin of all that we love. So resolved, Gil-Galad took counsel with Elrond Half-Elven and Círdan, who carried with them lore of the west beyond the knowledge of most. They knew well that to challenge Númenor openly would be a bitter enterprise, for the sea power of men was vast, and their armies and armaments were beyond compare. Nonetheless, Gil-Galad declared that if persuasion failed, he would stand against the Armada's departure, if only to stay the evil day. Word sped across the waters by way of trusted mariners who still favored the friendship of the elves. And to Armenellos, the capital of Númenor, there came Gil-Galad's herald, an elf named Calamendal, wise in speech and gentle of bearing. Calamendal was admitted into the presence of Ar-Pharazôn, where he repeated the message entrusted to him, that the elves pleaded with the king to forbear from his course, and that Gil-Galad begged an audience to discuss the grave matter of sailing west. But the proud king, enthroned amidst splendors of gold and ivory, dismissed Calamendal with scorn. "Tell your master," he said, "that the king of Númenor has no need of counsel from those who cling to the old ways. We have grown mightier than the elves, and we have the might to confront even the Vala if we will it. Our ships are unstoppable, our warriors trained in craft of arms far exceeding that of Linden. Stand not in our path." Thus Calamendal returned without hope, yet he bore a bitter fruit of knowledge, that Earpharazon's plan was far advanced. Indeed, the king of Númenor already had ships loaded with provisions, galleys bristling with arms, and every sign that the great armament was nearly ready to set sail. The hearts of Gil-Galad's people grew cold with fear, for they saw that the time for words was nearly spent, and only swift, decisive action might yet stave off a cataclysm. Some among the Eldar counseled that they should depart Middle-earth, sailing into the west themselves while the path was still open, leaving men to their fates. Others said that to provoke the wrath of Númenor was folly. Still others argued that if Númenor should succeed in defying the Vala, all would be lost anyway, for such a victory would mean dominion over the earth by mortal men enthralled by Sauron's counsel and corrupted by greed. Gil-Galad listened long and weighed every counsel. At last, he declared, "We shall not abandon Middle-earth, nor shall we yield the sea unchallenged. For if Númenor breaks the ban and attempts to land upon the undying shores, the fate of Arda may be cast into darkness. The Vala themselves cannot remain idle if such an outrage is committed. Yet we must do all in our power to forestall that hour or prevent it from occurring, even at great peril. Let Númenor mark my words. Gil-Galad will stand in their path, not as an enemy, but as a guardian of the music of the Aenir, that it may not fall into dissonance. If the King of Men insists upon this doomed course, we shall place ourselves between him and the west." Thus was prepared the greatest gathering of elven hosts since the days of the War of Wrath. From Linden, from the havens of Mithland, from Rivendell, and even from farther realms east where small enclaves of elves still dwelt, they came in answer to the High King's summons. They brought their ships, their spears, and their bows. Among them came lords of great renown. Glorfindel, who had returned from beyond the circles of the world to aid in Middle-earth's battles. Celeborn and Galadriel, though their realm of Lothlorien lay far to the east, they sent forth companies of skilled archers and wise guardians to stand in council with Gil-Galad. Galder of the Havens, Aristor of Imladris, and many others whose names were sung in later ages. The elves did not hunger for war, but they steeled themselves for the necessity that might arise. All along the western coasts of Middle-earth, Gil-Galad ordered fortifications to be raised. Watchtowers were erected, the natural harbors were fortified, and archers patrolled the cliffs and beaches. The elven navy, smaller than Númenor's but guided by ancient knowledge of the seas gleaned from the Falathrim, prepared for a blockade should the Númenorian fleet attempt to set sail from the havens they had built in Middle-earth. Yet Gil-Galad knew that direct confrontation would be perilous. Even the skilled mariners of Círdan could not easily stand against the sheer number of Númenorian ships. Therefore, Gil-Galad sought another means, to parley once more with the king or with any of his captains who might be less proud, to see if wisdom could still triumph. At length, Gil-Galad learned that Earpharazon intended to embark from Umbar, in the south of Middle-earth, where the Númenorians had a great port and fortress, prepared decades before. The rumor was that a massive part of Númenor's host was already landed there, along with vast stores of supplies, waiting only for the king's arrival and final muster. Gil-Galad thus resolved to travel with speed to Umbar by ship, bearing a flag of truce, to see if his entreaties might be heard before the final moment. He embarked on his flagship, Vingeloth's heir, so named in memory of Arendal's vessel of old, and was accompanied by a small, guarded retinue, Elrond, Glorfindel, and a company of Linden's best archers. None knew how the king of Númenor would react to the presence of the elven High King upon his very doorstep. Their journey south was largely uneventful, though the watchers in many places noted the signs of the Númenorians' preparations. War galleys moored in hidden coves, soldiers drilling upon the beaches, storehouses piled high. At last, they saw the dark shape of Umbar rising against the horizon, and the sea was thick with ships bearing the proud banner of the Golden King. Every mast bristled with the sun emblem or the scepter of Númenor. The elven ship glided quietly amidst them, and though the sailors of men were wary, none raised arms against Gil-Galad at that moment, for some memory of the old alliance and courtesy remained. So the elves were permitted to come into the great harbor of Umbar, where they were met by lordly captains of Númenor, clad in black and gold. Elrond's keen eyes perceived tension among them, but also curiosity. A voice rang out, "By order of Earl King of Númenor, you are bidden to speak your errand swiftly, for the hour of our sailing is near at hand." Gil-Galad, tall and bright in his armor, stepped forward and bowed with dignity, though his heart was heavy. "I come in the name of friendship that once was, and in the name of all free peoples. I would speak with your king or the greatest of his lieutenants, for I bear a warning that must not go unheard." For a moment it seemed the captains would refuse. But at the last, one who gave his name as Lord Hastendil relented and led Gil-Galad's company through the winding ways of Umbar's fortress. Many were the curious glances from the Númenorian soldiers as they passed, for never before had they seen the elven High King in person. Some regarded him with awe, others with dark suspicion. They were brought at length to a vast audience chamber within the fortress, where Earl awaited. Rich carpets covered the floors, and torches set in braziers lit the chamber with a flickering orange glow. The King of Númenor sat upon a chair of carven ivory, his cloak a deep crimson lined with gold. At his side stood a figure that Gil-Galad recognized immediately, though he did not betray his shock. Sauron, or Anatar as he had once been called, had taken on a fair semblance, robed in black, though cunning and malice shone in his dark eyes. Gil-Galad felt a surge of loathing, for he perceived that Sauron was no mere captive but rather the chief counselor of the king's pride, weaving poisonous words into Earl mind. Summoning all the restraint and majesty he could, Gil-Galad knelt neither to Earl nor to Sauron. Instead, he bowed politely, pressing his hand to his heart in elvish courtesy. "Hail, King of Númenor! I am Gil-Galad, son of Fingon, High King of the Noldor in exile. I come to beseech thee, turn aside from this course of sailing west. The road you seek is sundered from mortal footsteps by the decree of the Vala, and no blessing shall come from attempting to break that ban." Earl voice was deep and filled with authority. "Thy courtesy is noted, O King of the Elves, yet thou come unbidden, unwelcomed. Númenor has outgrown the tutelage of the Eldar, and we bear no love for those who would keep us in ignorance and mortality. Why should I heed this warning, which has already been repeated many times by lesser heralds?" Gil-Galad's voice rang clear in answer, though sorrow laced his words. "Great King, once men and elves were as brothers in arms, bound by kinship of old. We do not seek to keep you from knowledge, nor to hold you in thrall to mortality. We simply speak a truth that has ever been. Immortality belongs not to those born into the circles of men. Even we Eldar do not claim to wrest it from the design of Eru. To trespass upon the undying lands will bring only wrath and destruction. The powers do not grant that gift to mortals, and if you attempt to take it by force, your proud realm shall be shattered." Sauron's laughter echoed throughout the chamber. "Ah, Gil-Galad, still clinging to the fables of your kind. How many of your people have faded or fled across the sea? I wonder, in fear of the world's changes. The time of the elves is over, and the dominion of men shall soon begin in truth. And if the Vala themselves stand in our path, so be it. They have grown complacent, lost in their own bliss. We shall dethrone them, or we shall force them to accept the ascendancy of men." He smiled, a malicious light dancing in his eyes. "It may be that the High King of the Elves has come to bargain for safety, to submit his realm under the power of Númenor, in exchange for some favor when immortality is won?" A wave of indignation ran through Gil-Galad's retinue, and Glorfindel's hand drifted to the hilt of his sword, though he did not draw it. Gil-Galad raised his arm slightly, halting any outburst. "We bow to no darkness," he said calmly, "and we shall not stand idle while you cast away the destiny appointed to men, sowing destruction across land and sea." Earl lips curved in a small sneer. "And how do you propose to halt us, my Lord of Lindon? Even now, my hosts surpass anything the world has yet beheld. Our armada fills the horizon. We are unstoppable." Gil-Galad's voice became like tempered steel. "If the King of Númenor truly seeks to sail west by force, Gil-Galad shall stand in his way. Our watchers already guard the western coasts, prepared to block any attempt to depart. I do not offer war, but be warned. Neither shall we let you pass unchallenged. Still I beg you, pause, reflect, and counsel with me. Turn aside from destruction. Even if you succeed in sailing west, doom shall find you. Yet it need not be so. There was a murmur among some of Ar-Pharazôn's captains, for they had not expected the elves to threaten a blockade. Some whispered that to slay elves would be an evil deed that might further provoke the Vala. Others, however, were eager for conquest, prizing the wealth and knowledge that subjugating the Eldar might yield. Ar-Pharazôn's eyes flickered with a momentary uncertainty, for he was not wholly cruel in heart and might have once revered the Eldar, but pride soon conquered all. He turned to Sauron, as if to gauge his reaction, and the dark Maya merely folded his arms, letting the king decide. Eventually, Ar-Pharazôn spoke again in a thunderous voice. You dare to threaten the king of Númenor with your pitiful fleet and fortresses of stone and wood? The might of Númenor stands at my back, and your realm will burn if you oppose us. Go now, Gil-Galad. Return to your scattered strongholds. I grant you leave to depart in peace this once. Should I see your forces arrayed against us at the hour of sailing, I shall crush them without mercy. Let the Vala do as they will, but the age of men has come, and I shall not be gainsaid. With that, Gil-Galad knew further words would not avail. Even so, before turning to depart, he said softly, Alas for the line of Elros, so far fallen from wisdom and grace. I mourn what must follow. May Eru pity us all. Then he and his companions left, and the soldiers of Númenor escorted them to their ship. During the voyage back, Gil-Galad's heart was full of grief. He had not dared to hope that Ar-Pharazôn might truly listen to reason, but the finality of the meeting weighed upon him. Though doubt gnawed at him, wondering if any more cunning attempt at persuasion could have worked, he soon cast such thoughts aside. Sauron's malignant presence overshadowed the king's will, and that was the root of the doom overshadowing Númenor. Now the elves must do what they had resolved: bar the king's road westward at whatever cost. Swiftly the elven ships raced north to Lindon, passing word to all watchers along the coasts. Stand alert, for war might come from the sea. Armies were marshaled, and archers took position upon the cliffs. In the havens, certain oversaw the forging of new weapons. Their intent was not to wage open war upon Númenor, for they knew they could not hope to hold indefinitely against the entire might of Ar-Pharazôn's fleet. Rather, the plan was to blockade or delay them, forcing the king to tarry, in the faint hope that some unforeseen chance or counsel might turn him back. If that failed, they would fight with all they had to prevent the unthinkable from occurring. In the days that followed, watchers in the south reported the first stirrings. Númenorian ships began sailing northwards, bearing advanced detachments of soldiers, presumably to secure key ports and waypoints. Though the main fleet had not yet emerged from Umbar, it was clear that the time was drawing nigh. Gil-Galad ordered his captains to allow no Númenorian warships to gain footholds along the coast. Initially, the skirmishes were small, with Númenorian marines testing the defenses of the elven-held shores. The elves, for their part, attempted to drive them off with flights of arrows and skillful use of smaller, swifter ships that harried the edges of the enemy. In many of these skirmishes, Glorfindel himself led daring raids, using his legendary prowess to rally the elves' resolve. Yet the Númenorians were well-trained and outfitted, and they would not be easily turned away. Darkness began to loom over the once peaceful coasts. It was in one such engagement near the port of Vigneland, established long ago by the mariner Aldarion, and now a contested stronghold, that the first major clash occurred. A Númenorian squadron sought to land a regiment of soldiers on the beach, intending to capture the port storehouses and create a staging ground for the main fleet's eventual arrival. Gil-Galad's plan was to rebuff them at sea before they could disembark. So Círdan mustered a flotilla of swift vessels. The elves drew upon their knowledge of the currents and tides, setting ambushes in the shallow waters. As the Númenorian galleys rowed forth, the elves launched volleys of fire arrows. Many ships were set aflame, and the men of Númenor roared in anger, beating drums of war. Still, so great was their discipline that they pressed on, and soon a furious battle erupted on the sands and in the surf. Elves in mail of shining silver, men in black and gold livery, clashed with spear and sword, the tide stained crimson. The gulls circled overhead, crying a lament for those who fell. Cerdain's mariners fought with agility and grace, striking swiftly and retreating into shallows where heavier Númenorian armaments were unwieldy. Yet the men of Númenor were unyielding, and eventually they succeeded in establishing a foothold upon the beach, though at heavy cost. The elves withdrew further inland, fighting every step of the way. When word of this reached Gil-Galad, his brow creased in worry. The might and discipline of Númenor were on full display, and if these were but vanguards, the main host yet to come, he would be unstoppable in a direct confrontation. Still, the elves did not lose hope entirely. They withdrew to stronger positions, using forested ridges and swift horses for mobility, striking at supply lines and harassing the men at every turn. Small victories they achieved here and there, though more often they simply delayed the march of the Númenorians. And so it was that weeks passed in a tense stalemate along the coasts of Middle-earth, while rumors said that Eärfhérazon was still preparing the main fleet in Umbar for the final departure across the sea. Yet in the midst of these battles, something unexpected occurred. A group of Númenorian officers, disillusioned by the cruelty and pride of Eärfhérazon's aims, began to question their orders. Some still remembered the old friendships with the elves, cherished the memory of Tar Palantir's wise reign, and saw that the doom of Númenor would be sealed if this madness continued. This group was clandestinely led by none other than Amandel, father of Elendil, though in this altered chain of events, the timeline of his actions took on a different shape. He had traveled in secret to Middle-earth ahead of the king's armada, hoping to find Gil-Galad or his envoys, to beg them for a chance at peace. Gil-Galad, upon receiving word of this from scouts, agreed to meet Amandel in a remote glen by night, far from the watchful eyes of the main armies. When Gil-Galad arrived at the appointed place with Elrond and a handful of guards, he found Amandel waiting, cloaked to conceal his identity from prying eyes. The old Númenorian knelt in respect. "My lord Gil-Galad," he said softly, "my heart is torn by what I have witnessed these past months. Númenor, once noble, has strayed from the path. Our king's pride, stoked by the lies of Sauron, seeks to fling open the doors of Aman itself. I fear doom shall come of it. Many of us who cherish the memory of the elves stand powerless to change Eärfhérazon's will. But if war is kindled between us, the ruin shall be total." Gil-Galad offered him a hand. "Rise, friend of old. The house of Amandel is well known to us, and your father's father was dear to the Eldar. If there is any counsel you can bring that might avert this conflict, speak it." Amandel explained that some among the faithful Númenorians had decided not to support the invasion of Aman. Indeed, they looked upon Eärfhérazon's venture as both blasphemous and doomed. However, they were not strong enough to openly oppose the king. Sauron had turned the greater part of the populace against the elves, feeding them with lies that the Vala had withheld immortality out of jealousy, and that the Eldar conspired to keep men subservient. Amandel's plan was to gather as many ships and loyal men as he could, then make for Middle-earth to resettle there, far from the reach of the king's ambitions. But time was running short, and the king was watching the faithful with suspicion. "If there is any way to stay Eärfhérazon's hand for a while longer, it may give us the chance to rescue those who wish to depart before the final doom," he said. Gil-Galad was moved by Amandel's plight. He agreed that any among the faithful should be permitted refuge in Lindon if they managed to escape Númenor, for the bond between elves and the line of Elros was not wholly shattered. But how to delay Eärfhérazon further? It seemed a nearly impossible task, given that the king's fleets stretched far and wide. Then Elrond, after a time of silent thought, said, "There is a rumor that even in Númenor's power, it is not easy to coordinate so vast an armada. Sauron's cunning must be behind much of it. If we can disrupt the chain of orders, causing confusion and miscommunication among the fleets in Middle-earth and the main muster at Umbar, we might buy time. Yet that would require cunning of our own, and some knowledge of the enemy's signals, codes, and chain of command." Amandel admitted that among the faithful there were certain captains with knowledge of the king's signals and military protocols. Perhaps, if they dared infiltration and sabotage, they might slow the movement of the fleets. Though the plan was dangerous, Gil-Galad deemed it worth an attempt. So it was arranged that Amandel would make contact with such captains in secret. Meanwhile, the elves would continue their blockade efforts, feigning that they intended to hold the coast at all costs, drawing Númenor's attention to open battle while, behind the scenes, the subterfuge took shape. For a time, this strategy proved effective. Elven forces launched small raids against Númenorian outposts, forcing the enemy to dispatch reinforcements. Meanwhile, the ships in the south languished, waiting for clear orders that never arrived or that were contradicted by falsified messages from supposed Númenorian high command. Some fleets began to reposition, suspecting trickery, while others refused to move without confirmation from Eärferazon himself. A climate of suspicion grew, with officers accusing each other of disloyalty. Gil-Galad's watchers noted these signs and redoubled their efforts, sensing that the confusion might keep the great armament from departing as soon as it had intended. Yet Eärferazon was no fool, and Sauron's malice was keen. Soon, they discovered rumors of treachery within their ranks. The king grew wrathful, and Sauron cunningly turned suspicion upon any who showed even a shred of mercy toward the elves or doubts about the invasion. A purge was ordered among the armies in Middle-earth, and men loyal to the king began arresting and executing suspected traitors. Amandel and many of his followers fled for their lives, with some perishing in the attempt. Even so, enough of the faithful escaped to Gil-Galad's realm, bringing word that the king's patience was at an end. He would set forth with all his might, and no blockade or sabotage would be allowed to stand in his path. Now a grim resolve settled upon Lindon. The warnings of the elves had gone unheeded. All that remained was to stand firm at the final hour. Gil-Galad deployed his forces along the coasts, focusing especially upon key passages where the king's fleet would likely attempt to pass. Among these were the straits north of the Andras Peninsula, the seas west of Mithland, and the waters near the Isle of Tol Eressëa, should the king attempt to sail around the north. Indeed, every route seemed fraught with peril for those who would come and go in the might of war. The watchers could do no more than wait, arrow knocked upon bowstring. At last, the day arrived when Eärferazon's main fleet appeared on the horizon, sailing northwards from Umbar in a formation that seemed endless. The sky darkened with the approach of so many sails, and a hush fell upon the elves who stood upon the western cliffs. Trumpets sounded from the lead galleys, sending a note of challenge across the water. Gil-Galad could not help but admire the grand sight, for the ships of Númenor gleamed with cunning craftsmanship, and the disciplined rowers propelled them swiftly. But overshadowing any admiration was dread. For at the head of the fleet was the king's flagship, Alcarandas the Golden, a massive vessel that towered above even the proudest elven vessels. Gil-Galad signaled for his mariners to move into position, forming a defensive line of smaller ships bristling with archers, while ballistae and catapults stood on the shore. A volley of warning arrows cut through the air. The Númenorians answered with their own war machines. Thus the great confrontation began. Elven cunning and speed against Númenorian might and numbers. The sea churned with the wreckage of ships as each side dealt blows to the other. Despite the skill of the elves, the weight of numbers soon took its toll. Many elven ships were shattered, and Gil-Galad's heart was pierced by the sight of so many of his kin lost to the waves. Eärferazon himself stood upon the prow of Alcarandas, clad in plate of black and gold, shouting commands that echoed across the chaos of battle. Behind him stood Sauron, silent yet exultant, for the Dark Maya took pleasure in the shedding of elven blood and in the knowledge that his plan to provoke the wrath of the Vala was nearing fruition. The elven blockade began to break as the heaviest warships of Númenor pressed forward. Still, Gil-Galad refused to yield. Again and again the elves rallied, launching devastating arrow fire at the Númenorian decks, toppling masts and setting sails aflame. But the unstoppable tide rolled on. Desperate, Gil-Galad commanded his flagship to draw near Eärferazon's vessel, hoping to force a parley or at least buy more time. The two ships' prows clashed amidst the swirling sea. Grappling lines were thrown, and soon elves and Númenorians crossed swords upon the decks. Gil-Galad, his spear Aeglos in hand, fought with a fury born of despair, felling any who opposed him. For a moment, he beheld Earpharazôn across the chaotic melee, a proud figure blazing with the black flame of pride. Their eyes met, and Gil-Galad lifted his voice. "King of Númenor, still there is time. Turn back." But Earpharazôn sneered. "This ends now, Gil-Galad," he roared, brandishing a great sword that crackled with fell enchantments, likely bestowed or taught by Sauron. A ring of Númenorian warriors closed around them, preventing the Elven King's retinue from coming to his aid. An epic duel ensued upon the decks of Alcarandas as the tumult of battle surrounded them. Sparks flew each time Aeglos met Earpharazôn's blade. The Elven King's skill was legendary, but Earpharazôn was a formidable warrior in his own right, bolstered by the might and arrogance of one who believed himself unstoppable. Even in that deadly strife, Gil-Galad strove not for the king's death but for a chance to force him into truce. However, Earpharazôn pressed the attack relentlessly. The deck shuddered with the force of their blows, and the sea's spray was tinted red with the blood of the fallen. Near them, Sauron looked on with a detached interest, letting the king fight his own battle. For Sauron knew that even if Earpharazôn fell, the dark plan to incite the wrath of the Vala would likely remain in motion. Meanwhile, Gil-Galad's companions fought desperately to keep the other Númenorians at bay. Elrond, wielding a long sword of hidden power, tried to push closer to aid his lord, but the press of the king's guard was too great. At last, Earpharazôn's sword scored a cut upon Gil-Galad's arm. The Elf King staggered slightly, blood staining his mail. With a triumphant shout, Earpharazôn raised his blade for the finishing blow, but Gil-Galad, recovering swiftly, thrust Aeglos forward in a sudden counterstrike. The spear struck the king's sword arm, forcing him to drop his weapon. In that moment, Gil-Galad might have ended Earpharazôn's life, but he stayed his hand, instead pointing the gleaming tip of Aeglos at the man's throat. Breathing heavily, Gil-Galad cried out, "Surrender this folly, or your final hour has come." But before the next heartbeat passed, a black bolt of sorcery, cast by Sauron, coursed through the air and struck Gil-Galad in the chest. The Elf King was thrown back, reeling from the dark magic. Earpharazôn, seizing his chance, hurled himself forward and tackled Gil-Galad to the deck. The two struggled, but the force of the blow had weakened Gil-Galad. Númenorian soldiers rushed in, forcing the elven retinue to retreat or be overwhelmed. In the confusion, Elrond and Glorfindel fought ferociously to break through, but wave upon wave of soldiers barred their way. Seeing the battle hopeless and the blockade crumbling, the elves signaled a retreat. The deck of Alcarandas was a swirl of chaos. Gil-Galad, wounded and dazed, managed to slip from Earpharazôn's grip for a moment, aided by Elrond, who finally broke through. Together they fought their way to the ship's rail. With a final desperate leap, they plunged into the sea. Some of the elves in smaller vessels came alongside under arrow fire, dragging the wounded king aboard one of their boats. Earpharazôn, clutching his bleeding arm, roared commands to pursue, but the swirling conflict prevented an immediate chase. Thus did Gil-Galad narrowly escape with his life, though battered in both body and spirit. The outcome of that struggle left the elves in dismay. Their blockade was broken, their forces scattered. The battered remnants retreated further north or into hidden harbors, no longer able to mount a serious challenge on the open sea. Earpharazôn, though wounded, proclaimed that the Elven King's defiance had been crushed. Now nothing remained to stop the Grand Armada of Númenor from sailing west as planned. The captains of the fleet regrouped, putting in at various captured ports for repairs and resupply. Even as the casualties on both sides were tallied, great indeed was the cost. The hearts of the Númenorians were steeled with a grim determination to fulfill their king's ambition. Sauron stood at Earpharazôn's side, whispering that victory was assured and that the Vala would quail before the might of the Golden King. In Lindon, Elrond and Círdan tended to Gil-Galad's wounds. Though physically he could recover, the deeper wound was upon his spirit. for he felt that all efforts to stop the king had failed. The war had done little but spill Elven and Númenorian blood. Now the clock of doom ticked onward, unstoppable. Many elves lamented that so much life was lost in an attempt to forestall the inevitable. Some, in their grief, suggested that it might have been better to stand aside and allow the king to sail to his own destruction, trusting in the Vala to punish his arrogance. But Gil-Galad knew that the consequences of Númenor's downfall could devastate Middle-earth. If the Vala uprooted the island realm or changed the shape of the world, entire coasts might be drowned, entire kingdoms broken. And even so, he had not wholly forsaken hope that some means might be found to avert the final cataclysm. Yet no further chance presented itself. The great armament of Númenor, reassembled and repaired, eventually cast off from Middle-earth, bearing Eärferazon and Sauron, along with their countless legions. A hush lay on the seas in their wake. Gil-Galad, having no further recourse, ordered the elves to watch from afar and begin preparing for cataclysmic events that might ensue if the Vala intervened. He instructed Círdan to gather ships that could swiftly bear survivors inland if the seas rose in wrath. Days stretched into weeks and weeks into months. The watchers upon the coast scanned the horizon, seeing no sign of the Númenorian fleet's return. Dark clouds gathered ominously in the western sky, and the air was filled with a strange stillness, as if all of nature held its breath. Then, one fateful dawn, came a terrible sight. The sky burned red, and lightning ripped across the heavens without rain. The sea itself seemed to boil in the distance. A roaring wind swept in from the west, shrieking as if the very fabric of the world were being torn asunder. Gil-Galad stood upon the highest tower in Mithland and beheld what seemed a bending of the sky and sea. A sense of doom pressed upon the hearts of all who witnessed it. For in that moment, the Vala had laid down their guardianship of the world, calling upon Eru Iluvatar to judge the folly of men. The shape of Arda was changed, the straight road to Aman removed from the circles of the world. The seas rose in great towers of water, and the coastline of Middle-earth was hurled back or drowned in many places. The watchers beheld a monstrous wave surging east, unstoppable, devouring the shores. Gil-Galad and his people fled to higher ground, and even from afar they saw how the land was reshaped, hills collapsing, harbors swallowed by the sea. Screams echoed across the battered coasts. The mightiest works of elves and men alike were undone in the blink of an eye. Thus came at last the downfall of Númenor, though in this altered history, Gil-Galad had sought to prevent it by blocking their westward path. Perhaps, in some measure, the elven blockade delayed the final sailing long enough for more of the faithful to flee, thereby saving greater numbers from destruction. Indeed, in Lindon's harbors arrived several battered ships carrying Elendil and his sons, Anarion and Isildur, along with others. They were welcomed by the elves, who gave them what aid they could. Once the waters receded and the storms abated, the battered survivors emerged to discover a changed world. Númenor was gone, swallowed by the sea, and the undying lands were lost to the mortal realm. But some portion of the old friendship between elves and men was rekindled in the aftermath of the cataclysm, for they had stood together in their final hours. And what of Eärferazon's grand armada? It never returned. Some tales say that as he set foot upon the shores of Aman, the earth opened to swallow him and his host. Others speak of a final swirling vortex that dragged them into a deathless void, a punishment for their defiance of the ban. The record is unclear, for none who went on that journey ever returned to speak of it. Sauron too lost his fair form in the ruin, though he fled back to Middle-earth in spirit, again to trouble the lands in later days. Gil-Galad, though never fully free of sorrow for the bloodshed and strife that preceded the downfall, found a measure of relief that at least some portion of the faithful Númenorians had survived to found new kingdoms in exile. In the years that followed, Middle-earth entered a new phase of history. The seas had changed, the west lay veiled beyond mortal reach, and the lines of Elendil established realms in Arnor and Gondor. These survivors, grateful for the elves' succor, maintained close ties with Gil-Galad's realm, forging a last alliance that would eventually rise against Sauron in the War of the Last Alliance. Indeed, in that war, Gil-Galad and Elendil would stand side by side upon the plains of Mordor, united against the same evil that had corrupted Númenor and spurred its downfall. Long after those events, the elves who sailed across the sea or tarried in Middle-earth sang of the day when Gil-Galad sought to bar the mighty king of Númenor from his folly. Some songs honored the bravery of the blockade, even though it failed to prevent the final cataclysm. Others mourned the many fallen, and the proud ships of the Eldar that were lost in the sea battles. Yet a thread of hope ran through these lays, for the blockade and the resulting delays allowed many of the faithful to escape Númenor's doom, preserving a spark of that ancient friendship between elves and men. And so a seed was planted that would grow in time to shape the fortunes of Middle-earth's final struggles against Sauron. In this alternate weaving of the grand tapestry, Gil-Galad did not silently watch as Eärférazon courted ruin. Instead, he stood upon the threshold of the West, placing his realm between the men of Númenor and the fulfillment of their darkest pride. And though his efforts were in large measure undone by the sheer momentum of the king's will and the whispered malice of Sauron, the attempt itself left ripples in the fate of many. For who can say how the music of the Aenir might have sounded had Gil-Galad allowed the king to pass unchallenged? In the end, the shape of the world was bent, Númenor lost, and Eärférazon's folly paid for in countless lives. Yet in the reflection of those deep waters, one may still glimpse the slender hope that rose from the wreckage. The faithful, guided by Amandal's line, forging new bonds with the elves and preserving, against all odds, the legacy of elder days into the Third Age. And so it came to pass that Gil-Galad's bold resolve to oppose the men of number. Aenir stood as a testament to the shared history and the tragedy of elves and men. Though he could not prevent the cataclysm, he offered them a final chance, a moment to pause, to question, to flee. That moment made all the difference for Elendil and the seeds of the kingdoms that would one day unite against Sauron. For the wise who look back upon those days, they see in Gil-Galad's blockade and half-failed, half-fruitful negotiations a strand of fate that would lead, in time, to the War of the Last Alliance, to the forging and the destruction of the One Ring, and eventually to the dominion of men, though of a very different kind than Eärférazon had imagined. If there is a lesson in this tale, it is that even in the darkest hours, when the pride of the mighty threatens to upend the world, small acts of courage and fidelity can echo through the centuries, shaping the destiny of all who come after.